So, I'm going to start this mini lecture by talking a little bit about aging and old age within LGBTQ populations. Really, the majority of the data is really about lesbian and gays, um, because we just haven't done a lot of research as we found in this course. So today we'll talk a little bit about the style of aging and how people successfully age. And I say successfully, but note that that's in quotation marks, because how we define successful aging really is somewhat biased according to the literature. But we'll get to that. Then after this, in the next series, I will talk about ageism in the LGBT community. And then on Wednesday, we'll do health disparities and grief and bereavement. Okay. So let's start by talking about the LGBTQ populations in relation to older adults. Right now, we estimate that there are about 39 million people in the US that are aged 65 and older. That population is growing extensively. Of those, we estimate that about 2.4 million are LGBT people 65 and older. Again, that estimate really varies based on how we define who is part of an LGBT group, but this is using sort of current Williams Institute data. In fact, if you look, this is the graph here is the population within the US as a proportion of the total population. So these are people 65 and older. In 1975, these people represented about 10% of the population. And of course, as you recognize, and as you probably heard in other classes, that proportion of individuals has increased and will continue to increase. And in fact, they likely will look like what we often stereotype Florida to be, that the proportion of people in Florida that are 65 and older in 2018, you can see that here in the red bar, was about 20% of the population. In the year 2000, people 65 and older represented about 12% of the population. They were almost to that Florida number by 2025. We estimate that by 2050, 21% of the people in the US will be 65 and older. That is because of improvements in healthcare and improvements in quality of life that we've been able to access. Now, there have been a few recent changes where the life expectancy for people is starting to go down for the first time in a long time. That is mostly actually for white men because of increases in drug-related deaths and suicide. So it's actually, we've still seen some important gains in life expectancy for populations of color. So we'll see in the next couple of decades that, of course, these changes have important implications for LGBT people because we represent an enormous, a significant number of the population. But in fact, there's very little both research looking at what are some of the changes that are happening across people's lives as they're getting older, and what are some of the complications or problems that they're experiencing. Remember, we talked about that minority stress model, that in fact some of the experiences that older adults who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans are going to start to experience as they're hitting their age where they might retire or making to go back into the labor force if they have to continue to work. If they're going to enter a retirement community, what are some of the implications that that's going to have for them? So let's talk a little bit about some of the problems. So first of all, we recognize that in fact LGBT people's lives are largely invisible as older adults. We don't talk about them in popular culture. There are very few television shows or media examples that really highlight some of this. Most of the research that's out there, most of the discussion that's out there, if there's any at all, focuses on older gay men or lesbian women. But there's also this assumption that as you get older, there is this sense of declining interest in sex and sexuality, that you're not forming relationships, that it's often perceived as this slow, gradual walk towards death. But in fact, we know, and we've known for a long time from research in heterosexual cisgender populations, that the importance of sex actually continues to be important in couples in their 60s, 70s, and even their 80s. Again, it's not as frequent, but it still is an important part of their lives. In addition, more important even maybe than just the sexual experiences is the social relationships and how to maintain social friendships as well as romantic relationships as you get older, especially because LGBT Q populations may not necessarily, and up until recently, haven't been able to get married. They're much more likely to be living single, to be living alone. So the value and the importance of those social relationships is critically important. So one of the things that we recognize and that we've known for a long time in developmental research is that people's experiences that they have and the changes that they have as they get older really change, and they really depend on some of the experiences that have happened to them when they're younger. We generally call this the Lifecourse approach or Lifecourse theory. What this says is that those changes that people have across their life are not just dependent on the age that they happen to them, right? So children have a certain set of experiences that happen to them that help to shape who they're going to be and who they are. Adolescents and teenagers have a different set of experiences. Emerging adults in the 18 to 25-year-old range have a different set of experiences, separate from people in their middle ages, in their 40s and 50s, and then older adults, which we say to be in their 60s and 70s, and then fourth age older adults who are in their 80s and 90s. So in fact, actually, in addition to those changes that are different as you age, that also interacts with other things that are happening. So the things that happened to you when you were 5 or 6 shape the kind of person that you become and that you are in your 50s and 60s. And of course, I think that makes sense to us, right? So if you had a difficult time coming out when you were in your teens or your early adulthood, that's going to shape the kinds of experiences and what you expect of people in your 60s and 70s. If you have to move into a retirement community or a retirement home, you may go back in the closet, for example, because you're worried about how people are going to react if you had a really harmful or negative coming out experience when you were younger. The other thing that may happen is what we call cohort effects, that the experiences that you had have shaped you because of, for example, if you're, and we'll talk about millennials for a second. Millennials have been strongly shaped by the global recession that happened in 2008 to 2010. Millennials were shaped by September 11th, 2001, for example, right? So there are certain experiences that have shaped people based on their cohort, just like baby boomers were partially shaped by the after effects of World War II and the Cold War that was happening here in the United States. In addition, though, there are also, in addition to these cohort effects and the experiences you had when you were younger, there's also these major historical experiences that shape everybody, maybe regardless of your cohort. So people's views about what it's like to enter the workforce and the importance of going to college, for example, right? Generally, I would say most adults see that college is really important and that it's what you need today to be successful. So that's a historical experience that, regardless of your cohort, you may all value. One of the things that this life course theory really tells us, not surprisingly, is first of all that older adults are not a homogeneous group. First of all, we generally see it as older adults, anyone who's 60 or over, if you want to put a hard number to it. But in fact, we generally have divided up those two groups of people into two separate groups. People in their 60s and 70s, which is your third age older adults, and then people in their 80s and 90s, who are your fourth age older adults. And those experiences are also very different for those two groups. In addition, though, the kinds of challenges that people are experiencing really vary based off of their gender and their sexual orientation and their gender identity, right? As we've kind of talked about, that intersectionality. That if you're a person of color who is transgender and you have experienced lots of discrimination and lots of job instability, you may not have the ability to even consider a retirement and what that's going to look like, right? Your expectation may be that you're going to work for your entire life and that you've been maybe have been struggling in poverty potentially. We know, in fact, right, that trans women of color are much more likely to be living in poverty than other groups, for example, that they're compared to. Let's take a look at actually some cohort-related effects that to sort of help understand what's happening in older adults. I'm going to use the Pew Research Center's definition of generations. So the silent generation, which goes from 1928 to 1945, the baby boomers or the boomer generation, as we're kind of making fun of right now in social media, from 1946 to 1964. So they end at the end of World War II, up through the mid-60s. Generation X, which goes from 1965 through 1980, millennials from 1981 to 1996, and then Gen Z, which starts in 1997. We don't actually have a hard point and end point for Gen Z yet. So we'll see where that is. But right now, the Pew Research Center has estimated that to be around 2012. Okay. So we know that millennials, for example, right, as some of you might be, were strongly shaped by September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks here in the United States. Millennials may have been shaped by the shadow of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. They may have been impacted by the importance of the youth vote in 2008 election, and how that helped to change the electorate and the president that we had. In addition, though, millennials came of age during a time when there's a major economic recession, and so it means that millennials often do not see the importance, do not see that, or don't perceive that they're going to be able to retire like earlier generations might have been able to, like baby boomers or Gen Xers. In addition, millennials may have grown up with lots of technology, right? So there are important differences there. Now let's go backwards, right? So let's look at baby boomers, for example, who are older adults. LGBT, and again, most of the research here is in gay and lesbians. Baby boomers grew up in a time, in fact, when they were recovering from World War I. They are more likely to be really frugal with money. They really see the value of working hard and that you have to work hard to get ahead. In fact, actually, there are some interesting similarities between baby boomers and millennials because of the experiences that they had. There's also some interesting similarities between the silent generation, which grew up during the Great Depression, and millennials. So you may find that millennials actually share more in common with some of these earlier generations, even though often social media sort of makes fun of or comments on how different they are. Millennials are, you may think of them as coupon clippers, right? They're really conscientious about how much money they're spending on things. That actually is very similar to baby boomers and the silent generation because of some of those experiences in the post-World War I, post-World War II world and the Great Depression that happened in the 1930s here in the United States. So in fact, we know that there are some important differences that are happening in LGBTQ people's lives. Baby boomers who are lesbian or gay were not able to come out very easily. If they did come out, they may have had a shadow marriage or a shadow relationship where they were married as a way to sort of, or a cover marriage, to sort of protect themselves against discrimination, to sort of, because it wasn't okay to come out at that point. So they may have children from previous marriages. They may have a former spouse from that marriage, and in some cases they may be close with that spouse. In other cases they may not be. In some cases, baby boomers actually may have only recently come out. Sometimes baby boomers may wait until their children have left home, so they may be in their 50s or 60s before they come out, which means that they're recently having some of those coming out experiences that a millennial or a Gen Z may have been able to have when they were younger, potentially. So what does it look like to age successfully in general? So let's look at the model from a general model about successful aging, and then we'll see if we can apply that to lesbian and gay, bisexual, and transgender people. This is Michael Lawton's Competence Environmental Press model of aging. I'm going to sit here for a second so we can kind of take in the graph. There are two things really this model suggests really drive your ability to cope with and age successfully. One is the level of competence. Do you feel skilled? Do you feel like you have the ability to adapt to the environment around you? And then also, how much environmental pressure are you experiencing, or environmental press? So if there's not a lot of environmental press right here, so it's weak, you don't have a lot to do, no one really presses you or pushes you to be involved or engaged, that will combine together with your level of competence. So if you have low competence, maybe you have a disability that makes it difficult for you. Maybe you have something like dementia, which is making it difficult for you. In some cases, actually, you may have weak environmental pressure, but low competence that actually works together to put you in a zone of maximal comfort. So you get enough support from the people around you. Your family or your friends are there for you to give you the assistance you need. And you're able to be comfortable, but you're not really performing at your best, right? Nobody really asks you to keep up with a lot of other activities. Whereas if we put you in a little bit more of a stressful environment, maybe we put you in an environment, we'll use the example of dementia. you're really struggling to remember day-to-day tasks and to take care of yourself, but you have a caretaker, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a professional caretaker, who actually asks you to practice those skills, to keep trying to build your memory, to keep doing tasks like reading and puzzle and doing some basic shopping for yourself, that would get you in this stimulation zone where then you're able to sort of meet your needs in as much as you can, but you also have the support system when you need it. We wouldn't want that person to be living completely on their own, right? Because then they have too much press, they have too much pressure, they cannot manage, right? They can't just live on their own in a home with no support at all. So we want both the combination of competence taken into account with the amount of environmental pressure. This generally says that there's a balance point in here between maximal comfort and maximal performance potential. And you want to sort of keep it somewhere in there, and you want to adapt it over time based on both the environmental pressure and their level of competence. So again, there are some interesting models that have happened in Europe suggesting that people with different kinds of dementia live in these supportive communities, but are still expected to do some basic caretaking for themselves. And that actually helps them to live successfully because people just don't ignore them and say, oh, we're going to do everything for you. And we actually assume that you're going to help to take care of yourself in as much as you can. And that over time, as you age, as you start to lose functioning, we're going to change the amount of support and stimulation that you get to keep you in this adaptation zone or adaptation level. You might think of this in this competence environmental press model as an example of people who are proactive. So they're choosing new behaviors to exert control over the changes in their life. These are this is what we get when people are high in competence, that they can be proactive, they can go out, they can choose tasks for themselves. They often are pretty high functioning, they're aging really well. That is different than people who are in a state of docility. These is where they're allowing the situation to dictate their options. They basically have said, look, I don't have the ability to age successfully. There's nothing I can do. Maybe it's an older adult who is retired or has stopped working, and they feel like there's nothing they can do in this situation. They're bored. They don't have any hobbies to do in their life. They don't have a strong social network. In that case, these people often enter a state of deep depression. This state of depression also brings with it an increased risk of suicidal ideation and self-harm attempts. So there is some level where we want to try to encourage competence in people, but also recognize, right? I mean, of course, we're a psychology class. We're talking about that really part of this is about what's happening within the individual, right? It's how proactive they are versus how docile they are. But we also want to make sure that we're taking into account external environmental stressors, right, that are happening. You may not have the financial ability, you may not have the family support, there may not be other things that you have available to you, right, that you would need to be successful. It's not just a trait of the individual, it's also the social structures that are around them. We know, in fact, that one of the things that older adults who are part of the LGBTQ community are at risk for is social isolation. One important source of social support for aging adults is a spouse, which LGBT adults, only about 16% of them in the United States are married, compared to about 50% of LGBT adults in the general US population. Lesbian and gay older adults are much more likely to be single, much more likely to live alone. That does put them at risk for being socially isolated. In addition, greater risk is found possibly in transgender adults because medical fields often had the requirement that if you were going to transition, if you were going to be out as a trans person, that you had to leave your spouse if you had one, you had to move to a new area, and you had to start a brand new identity, right? That you had to leave all that behind to make this successful transition. That would mean that you are at greater risk for social isolation because you have essentially separated and left behind those ties that you had that might include for children and other adults and other individuals in your life. We've talked about, in fact, that transgender adults who can successfully maintain relationships with their children, if they have children, do that because they maintain those contacts, right? So again, the medical field has moved away from these early requirements, but these older adults that you may come into contact with probably still have some of the stigma and harm that has come from those early medical requirements. Um, the other thing that puts older adults at risk for social isolation is that they don't have the same opportunities for informal caregiving from family. If they came out in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1960s, 1970s, they may have left a spouse who didn't understand, was not supportive. Their children, they may be estranged from their children. Their parents may not have understood if their parents are still alive. Their siblings, their in-laws, all these what we often think of as primary methods of informal caregiving. So those are your spouse and your children. Right, as you get older, they'll come and help to take care of you. Your secondary informal caregiving is usually your parents or your siblings, and then your tertiary or third level informal caregiving are your in-laws. Lastly, though, is that LGBT adults probably have more opportunities for their chosen family to provide informal care, right? It is in some cases where people, older adults have friends who they can help to take care of them. This is much more common. In fact, there's a lot of evidence showing that LGBT older adults actually do really rely on that chosen family, and they have a really well-developed sense of a friend network that can help to provide some of that care as they get older. Lots of this research showing that gay men with HIV often relied on a strong social network to help provide some of their caretaking needs as they were getting sick from HIV/AIDS. Um, Overall, though, if we look at the research, of course, there are some challenges, some unique challenges to getting older that everybody experiences. In general, when we look at the research, the general media view is that older adults, especially lesbian and gay men, have sad, isolated, lonely lives. In fact, the research very much suggests the opposite, that lesbian and gay men generally are healthy, they are socially active, they engage selectively with the kinds of things they're doing. Yes, they're not maybe doing some of the things they were when in their 20s or 30s, but they are still actively engaged in their life successfully. But that there are some challenges, there are some disparities, especially in health and access to healthcare, access to retirement communities and retirement accounts and things like that. In our next lecture, we'll talk about some of those disparities and some of the ageism that exists within the LGBTQ community.